Hi everyone, you're with Business Insider. This is Sriram Iyer. The coronavirus crisis is evolving with every breath we take. While the societies and economies around the world are on lockdown, geopolitics and global power play have a life and a pace of their own. The tension between US and China has rattled markets most recently. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently cited an enormous evidence of a cover up by China, and now people fear that Beijing might retaliate. And all of this leads to a whole lot of speculation. But here at Business Insider, we believe why guess when you can know? And that is why we decided to bring you two people who are just as obsessed with China as you are or anyone else is, but in very different ways. If you're wondering who will come out on the top at the end of this coronavirus crisis, will it be China, will it be US, or will it be somebody else? You might find the answer today in the next half an hour. This is the fourth episode of the big reset. All you need to know to win in the post-COVID-19 world. This is a special partnership between Business Insider and the Observer Research Foundation, a leading think tank in India that policymakers just can't ignore. So join me in welcoming Parag Khanna, the most good-looking man in geopolitics and the managing partner at FutureMap, and Samir Saran, representing ORF on the panel today. Welcome, gentlemen, to Business Insider. Parag thinks that future is Asian. Samir thinks the future is China. And both of them don't like China as much, if I can say that. They can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I like either.
So let's see how much the two of them can agree on and who is more convincing to the larger audience, laymen like us. So Parag, let me start with you. Welcome to the special broadcast. I've been following you for a few years now, from your TED Talk way back to your latest book. And a lot of your premise hasn't changed. The fact that, the world is obsessed with China, but Asia is much bigger than that, and that people should look at it as a system, a trading, sort of a continent that trades within itself and has a lot more potential by itself. And it is the future, in the years to come, in the decades to come. Has the coronavirus crisis changed, the whole or parts of this premise in the last few months?
Great question, Sriram. And it's great to be with you and with Samir. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think you've started off with exactly the right question. So Asia is still a system. In fact, it will be even more of an integrated or interdependent system in light of the virus. Why? Because the rest of the world is not going to prove to be the economic engine that it has needed to be. Instead, Asia, yet again, even more so, as was the case after the 2008 financial crisis, people are looking to China, to Japan, to Southeast Asia, to India to be pulling the world economy forward. So one thing we have to be clear about at the outset is that we have a North American system, a European system, and an Asian system. Asia now has to further integrate in order to offset the decline in exports to the developed, mature, wealthy countries of the West, because those economies are obviously not in any shape right now. So that's number one. Number two, when it comes to China, this virus has absolutely reinforced magnificently the suspicion that all Asians have of China. What country is more suspicious of China than India, after all, besides Japan, right? So this intense suspicion is being magnified. You may have seen this, that the Kicker think tank, CICIR in China, has just released a report to the Ministry of State Security saying that the anti-Chinese suspicion has not been this high since after the Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, the Tiananmen Square massacre was entirely internal. What China has just done is to unleash epidemiological and economic havoc on the planet Earth. So the order of magnitude is substantial. Now, as it is, let's be clear, no country trusts China. We work with China, we all do business with China, we all trade with China, we all take investment from China, and so on and so on. But that does not mean you trust China. The mistrust of China will literally never return, ever. No matter how much we have to work with China, no matter which countries fall into debt traps with China, all of that will only reinforce the suspicion of China. And that will exist for the rest of our lives.
No, but I want to do a follow-up on this. But before that, let me open the floor to Samir as well to comment. And then I can take the question to each one of you separately. Samir, how do you want to respond to this? I think, this is a point at which both of you agree. China is not someone that everybody can trust easily. But does that change the fact that, it is a neighborhood bully, one of the it is 5 times, 10 times the size of each of its neighbors. It has more money, more pull, more power, more people, bigger market, and a more incentive for foreign investors to come in and be part of the Chinese system. And therefore, what do you have to say? How do you respond to Parag?
Sriram, I think Parag made two very important points. And I'm going to put words in his mouth so that my words have a greater gravitas.
Yes.
Since you have termed him as the best looking geopolitical opponent. He makes a larger point about clearly the end of a era. If we could call it Pax Americana, then Pax Americana. If you could call it an era of the Atlantic system, which was America and Europe, we could term it in that particular manner. But certainly what began in 2007-8 with the financial crisis ends with this pandemic, with the complete inability of modern developed economies to cope with the pandemic, with their inability to provide leadership to the rest of the world, be providing succor and aid and assistance to large swaths of geography.
No, Samir, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to simplify this for our audience, across Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, everywhere, not everyone is
and
on
TikTok.
the same page. And TikTok, of course. And the question is that, are you saying that when you say that the countries have failed, the system has failed, do you mean that this has rattled the faith in globalization even more than it was?
No, I think Sriram, you've jumped to the third point that I was about to make.
Okay.
The first point is that the countries are absent from global action. I think this is the first crisis in my lifetime that I see America absent from most geographies that are responding to a crisis. Earlier, if you had a crisis, you had Uncle Sam. That is over. You also had capabilities in Europe to intervene through human aid, through grants, through funds, through technology, through assistance. That is not present either. So you see the Atlantic system absent from largest parts of the world because they are fighting their own challenges. So first, the Pax America or the Atlantic system era is over. Second, what replaces it? And I think that's the big question. What is going to be a coalition or a collective or a grouping or a region that is going to begin to influence global politics? Now, clearly, the Asian century or Asia as a continent is very, very important. But is it a coherent continent? Do we have one Asia or do we have multiple Asias? And if we have these multiple Asias, do we have structures and regional arrangements that Parag has emphasized on? That have you built systems that can work together, or are you building divisions that are going to, in some sense, create more walls in the continent than connections across this geography? So I think that's the second question. That is Asia as a coherent entity ready to replace the Atlantic system? I doubt we still have some way to go. Now, what thereafter is left available for any of us to coalesce around? And one of the poles that has emerged, however bad, vile, malicious that some may call it, is what I in my book called Pax Sinica, China's World, which is a very different, very, for some compelling and for some malicious offering on the table. State-run, state-controlled capitalism, a degree of authoritarianism, weaponization of trade dependence, creating supply chains that perversely benefit Beijing, and creating dependencies and new tribute systems that will allow China to shape the global future, the future of the global order. And this is, in some sense, the Asia that is most visible to the largest parts of the world. So when we say the Asian century today, we are really talking about China. Because you're not going to see India with the same kind of economic and political clout. You see the Japanese do it in a Japanese style. They do a lot, by the way. The Japanese are doing a lot as well. They are responding to the rise of China, but they do it in a typical reticent, slower Japanese manner. And you see other Asian countries battling their own inner politics, economics, and social conditions. So to me, when you say the future is Asian, and as Parag very compellingly writes in his work, I agree. But currently, the definition of Asia has unfortunately been captured by the essence of China. And I think the key question before us is that can Asia mean more than China? Can we put forward a system, an arrangement, a coalition, Asian Union in the decade ahead? Can we have 7 or 8 important actors work together to create rules of trade, rules of war and peace, rules of conduct, rules of digital, rules of of rights and human security. And of course, how can we start influencing larger swaths beyond Asia?
Interesting. And I'm going to, let Parag respond to this. But I want to take this one point at a time for the ease of understanding for our viewers. To summarize what Samir said, that America is missing in action. When he says that, he means that it should have been the leader in curtailing this pandemic, but it has been caught chasing its own tail. Number two is that China, every time America is absent, or the Western powers, the democracies are absent, an authoritarian regime, a state-controlled system like China gains prominence. And when it gains prominence, it becomes more powerful, and it gains the power to assert itself and call the shots in the region that it is present in, which is Asia. So the question to you, Parag, is then let's take it one at a time. Does the American absence, is this the new normal is this part of the new normal that is coming into force, across different spectrums, right? I mean, whether it is at your workplace, whether it is in the markets, whether it is in economies, is the absence of America in the global order and the leadership that it used to provide, is it going to be the new normal in the near future?
There's no question that that's already been the case. Remember that Samir mentioned the financial crisis, and he talked about the delegitimation of the United States as a global leader since the financial crisis. Technically, you could actually go back to the post 9/11 terrorist attacks. That's 20 years ago, not just 12 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And the US response, overreaction, imperial overstretch, failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan before the financial crisis. Then came the financial crisis. Then came the Occupy Wall Street movement and the reaction to, very, crony style inequality, capitalism. Then you had Brexit and Trump. And now you have the mishandling of the coronavirus. So you have 20 years, even the youngest person in listening can remember some of these episodes of the world moving on and not expecting George W. Bush, nor Barack Obama, nor Donald Trump to provide the answers. So, even by asking the question, it's like, forget that era, it's gone. We would not be able to talk about what Asia is doing for itself, let alone debate who's the leader of Asia, but without even referencing the United States. All of that were completely in the past. So let's move on, and let's take Samir's. I think Samir, you phrased it far more eloquently than anyone I've literally heard in the last 10 years about these questions. If we talk about Asia, there's what Asia is versus what Asia should be, right? And you and I probably agree about the following. So what Asia is right now is, as a geographical space, is far larger than China. It is almost 5 billion people. Most of those people are not Chinese. And yet when the world looks at Asia, all they see is China. When the world looks at Asia, all they see is authoritarian regime systems, instead of saying that actually most Asians live in democracies. But it's like people ignore this because they ignore India. And it should be.
Parag, I want to jump in there for a minute, and just to sort of take this conversation, add a layer to this, which is basically, we all have issues with authoritarian regimes. But even in democracies spanning the world, the length and breadth of the world, there is a growing fascination for, strongmen leaders, who will, rule by the, sort of the weight of their sword.
Yeah.
And that is something that, voters don't seem to mind. And isn't that playing to China's strength?
No, I would say it doesn't necessarily. There's a big difference between authoritarianism and what I call technocracy, right? And the fact that democratic societies want to see a leader who has a long-term vision, who's a modernizer, who may be tough, it doesn't mean that they want to sacrifice democracy, right? Those are two different things entirely. Yes, Asians have a deferential mindset.
No, I'm not saying people will give up democracy. What I'm saying is the way people have frowned upon China for being an authoritarian regime for the last 30 years. People who grew up in my generation, they look at it as a possibility and possibly a necessary evil for growth to take place. And especially that is true in India for sure.
No, but to want a technocratic leader does not mean that you want to sacrifice democracy. To want to have certain Chinese characteristics of a strong and effective state is not to want to live under an all-powerful authoritarian regime, because no Indian wants that. And it's extremely important for the brand of Asia to not be held synonymous with a country like China, given what China is doing. Let me just sum it up in one sentence. The more China acts like China, the less anyone else on earth wants to be like China, right?
Yep.
And that's the way every Indian on earth should feel, every Western citizen on earth, and every African on earth should be saying, the more I can see inside China and see the way they've handled this virus, the way they suppress their people, the way they use technology as a tool of repression, the less I would ever want my country to be like that. And this is why you are having this backlash. And so Samir's second point, which I think is the biggest question in the world today, is how can Asia become more than just whatever China wants?
Correct.
Is the central geopolitical question of the next 80 years is simply how do you ensure multipolarity across Eurasia and therefore the world?
If I can just jump in to, in a sense, buttress what Parag is saying. I think the Chinese proposition to the world is quite clear, and it is quite loud to those who study politics sitting in India. What is the proposition? The proposition is that the world must be multipolar, aka I want to be part of the global management. The Americans have to make room for me. Second part of the proposition, Asia is unipolar. I will decide the future of Asia. The Chinese proposition is a unipolar Asia and a multipolar world, a G2 world and a U1 Asia. That is the Chinese proposition. Now, I think
Beautifully put.
the Asian century will become real when an Asian Union, which has China as a actor, is carved and put into place.
Okay.
And I think you will have to see a larger role for Russia. Americans, be ready for that. You will have to see a big role for Japan. You will see the warring cousins, India and Pakistan, in that architecture. You will see the warring brothers, Saudi Arabia and Iran, in that architecture. You will see a group of 8 or 9 emerge if an Asian Union has to be formed. A sensible Asian Union that allows energy flows, that allows trade flows, that allows a degree of peace and stability, and that allows prosperity beyond the mainland. And prosperity that doesn't serve only the mainland. We've seen prosperity across Asia, but for the benefit of the Mandarins in Beijing. I think it's time prosperity is decentralized and is available to the Central Asians, is available to the West Asians, is available to the South Asians.
Okay, so I want to. We're running out of time. This was fascinating, but I want to cut to the some of the operative parts of what I want to discuss. I think what decides the future and what place that India has in the future, whether it is in Asia or in the global order, will depend on what is the future looking like. What are the commodities that decide that are the most precious in the coming months, in the coming years? What are the businesses that are that are the most precious in the coming years? What are the technologies that are the most precious in the coming years? Can both of you take turns? Let's start with Parag. Can you list out 3 things that that will be most important in the economies, in the future economy, and out of which what India has and what it doesn't?
Sure. Well, the most obvious one for now is health tech, right? Biotech and so forth. So this is an area where, unlike China, again, India has been, in a way, involuntarily, but very positively thrust into the spotlight as one of the world's largest producers of generic medicines and a huge pharmaceutical research sector with a very transparent willingness to share, to sell, to ramp up production to the world, and not to make preferences based on geopolitical relations. So this is the literal definition of a public goods provider acting in the global interest. And India, no one asked India to do this. India did not, ask it to be put in this role, but India is handling this very well. That's number one. The second is clean technology, right? Becoming more energy self-sufficient. We do not need to live in a world where oil and gas are put on huge tankers and shipped around the planet Earth at the cost of billions of dollars and endless greenhouse gas emissions. So India can do much more domestically as a clean tech leader, solar, wind, biomass, and so on and so forth. I would like to see India do more of this. India doing it for itself is a huge contribution towards global public goods as well. You want to clean up the global planet, the global environment, India doing its part is a big contribution to that. And then digital technology. Right now, a lot of economists are looking at the unemployed labor force in the United States. Companies are saying, well, I'm not going to hire people to come back full time anymore. I'm going to hire remote workers. And I heard someone say just yesterday, well, then why hire Americans? You should just hire Indians, right? If you want a good software programmer, a good computer scientist, a good data architect, a good cybersecurity expert, you don't need to hire someone at twice the cost who's living in California. Hire an Indian. So, India's efforts, which could never be enough, right? Because we know that education is very uneven. We know that it's a pyramid, very unequal. So the more India can invest in education for all, technology education in particular, the more India obviously can be even more of a leader in global software exports and digital services than it has been.
So what does that do to Donald Trump's prospects in the near future, in the coming election? What I mean to ask is, his narrative is completely different from the future that we are projecting right now. And does that cut ties with American voters? Will it? And if it doesn't, then what?
Well, that foreign policy is only an issue in US elections and will be only now because of how the two candidates will try to outdo each other in bashing China and how tough they are on China and so on and so forth. It's not really a serious policy discussion. Immigration may also come up to some degree, and that does touch upon India. But right now, Trump is facing at this point, from the electoral college standpoint, a slightly uphill battle. But a lot could change, and these are not dynamics that we can control, and external forces are not going to shape the outcome at the end of the day. People are going to be voting based on what their pocketbook looks like at that point in time. And he's going to, you can tell with the way he's framing the vaccine issue. He's saying that we'll have the vaccine by January, and he's purposely choosing a date that is so close to after the election, saying that, re-elect me and I'll make sure that we remain on this path, basically. But it's all politics. Let's not pretend that this, what I think of as a pristine, high-level geopolitical conversation should not be muddied in the nonsense of political rhetoric in the US right now.
So you're saying it won't have an impact?
Our geopolitical conversation will not. Obviously, again, China will, but talking about China in the context of how you use it rhetorically in an American election has very little to do with China's actual role in the world, which is what we are having a very good conversation.
No, but sort of, trying to, cry wolf every time only, sort of increases the credibility of the wolf more than the person crying.
Well, it depends on if the person is legitimate or not. I think that's the whole message of the parable, isn't it? Not to cry wolf too much.
Can I just jump in?
Please.
I want to the same question Sriram asked you, but before that, quickly on the Trump point. I think let's be very clear that no serious person is going to be able to explain Trump to the world. He's someone you can explain. So let us not even get into that business of trying to speak for him or speak about him or rationally explain his action. It's not possible. India has done well in the last 4 years to protect itself from the idiosyncrasy of the White House. I think we have come out largely unscathed. We have not been one of Trump's victims. So chances are that whoever comes to the White House is not going to be worse off than our last 4 years. We have done well. Let's put it this way. Now, on your more important point, I think India has 3 big projects to offer to the world. And all of them have to do with building India itself. So I don't think Indian global projects are different to what India needs to do for itself. If we do it for ourselves well, the world benefits. And that is the advantage of the next 5 years of the India story. The first, he spoke about health tech, but let me talk about the larger SDG agenda. If I have to be able to find innovative solutions for 500 million Indian youth who have to study, if I have to find health systems for over 100 million old folks and many young millions of young Indians, I will be able to create solutions that are easily replicable in Africa, in other parts of Latin America and Asia. If I'm able to find solutions for direct benefit transfers and giving universal, the Indian version of the universal basic income, social protection, using mobile phones and technologies, giving a gig economy, framework that works for bottom of the pyramid societies, I will be discovering solutions for the world. So India has to meet its development goals in 2030. It will become the world's first $7 or $10 trillion economy in the next 15 years that will be powered purely through development policies. And it will be therefore the first development superpower of the world. It is not going to be a military superpower. It's not going to be a trade superpower. It's going to be an SDG superpower. As we get to that goal, we will create development solutions that are attractive to many others. Second, we will be the first $5 trillion economy, the first $10 trillion economy that will be carved and shaped and created in a carbon constrained world. We will be the greenest $5 and $10 trillion economy ever. We are already on the path to do that. We have per capita investments in solar energy 2 to 3 times more than those of the US, very similar to EU, much higher than China and Japan. So what I'm trying to say is India is already on way to becoming the first green $5 trillion economy. Now, this is a model that is easily exportable to the world. There are 2 benefits that come out of it. Number one, we can sell India in the next 5 to 10 years as we need to stimulate our economy, as we need huge amount of capital coming in from next year onwards to restart our lives. We can sell ourselves as the world's biggest green mitigation project. Invest in us and we will deliver the Paris goals to you. Make sure that our revival is green by design. Make sure our auto sector is revived through EVs. Make sure our buildings are green. Make sure when we redevelop our shanty towns into full cities, it's sustainable. Invest in us to meet your Paris goals. And I'm not saying give us aid. I'm not saying give us grant. I'm saying create commercial instruments to invest in India's green story. And that's the second deliverable. And the final deliverable is technology. I think there is China tech, where they have weaponized technology, and you have US tech, where they have capitalized technology. I think India tech, where you have public data sets available to much smaller businesses to invest into and benefit from. I think India tech is likely to emerge post this crisis, post this pandemic, and you can see the investments coming into one of India's platforms, Jio. You can see lots of other partnerships emerging. I think large amounts of pools of money are going to start investing in Indian platforms in the next 2 to 3 years. And the India tech story is being born during this crisis. I think that's the third offering to the world, that you don't have to be either authoritarian tech or completely capitalist tech. You can have a bit of socialist tech that India makes everything at the end of the day.
Call it, by the way, if I may, if Chinese tech is weaponized and American tech is corporatized, India tech is humanized.
Is humanized. That's right. So it's an SDG, climate, people-friendly tech. Of course, we have issues around privacy. I'm not saying that. Let's fight it out. Our courts allow that debate to take place. Our regulators intervene. We have a most forward-looking net neutrality regime. We have a right to privacy, fundamental right. So I think we do it our way. We do it loudly. We do it grumbling, but we do it. And we do it in an open and transparent manner. Our debates are there for the world to join into.
So I think this is an interesting point because so what you're saying is that if health tech, education, and in the India tech, and the various sort of versions of the technology related evolution and development that we are talking about, and clean energy, for example, something like a clean energy takes away the competitive edge that China has as a commodity supplier or a buyer in the world, that the power that it has wielded for 2 decades now, at least. Parag?
Well, China has already, there's one very important episode of China abusing its monopolistic power, and that's rare earth minerals. The reason that so many countries, especially Japan, began rapidly divesting out of China and pulling their supply chains out of China and diverting them towards Southeast Asia is precisely because China threatened to ban the export of rare earth minerals. It's tried also to gang up on the copper cartel, right? So anytime China has power on either side of the equation, it's tried to abuse it. And that actually hastens the rest of the world's efforts to circumvent that Chinese dominance. And that's happening again today. I just want to say, I think Samir's last points about India's role in the global future are an answer to the question that he raised at the beginning, which is how do we get beyond a China centricity? Here is India offering solutions and models and pathways for most of the world, because most of the world looks a lot more like India than it does like China. And I've spent a lot of time looking at the post-colonial world. As you guys know, the 150 countries of the world were born after 1945. None of them look like China. Almost all of them are like India. We are poor, we are fragmented, we are quasi-democratic, very devolved, dependent on public-private actors and charities to get things done, free and cacophonous places, parliamentary democracies. India is the role model for so many of these.
I'm going to counter that with another often used phrase, which is familiarity breeds contempt.
But distance makes and absence makes the heart grow fonder. And I think the audience and the market for the Indian model stretches around the Indian Ocean and beyond. And again, I even in Latin America and other places, I'm actually seeing a lot more conversation about what's happening in India. How can one do jugaad? Every country has to do that because no country has the capital that China has. So I think that India can, in a subtle way, in a humble way, simply.
Sriram, I just want to, and this is something for all of us to think about. What worries me is that we took such a bold and strategic, and I think for the first time, India made a geopolitical position well known to the world. Normally, it is one of either saying no or abstaining. But for the first time, it proactively decided it will oppose the Belt and Road Initiative. We were alone at the time that India was questioning the Chinese global ambitions. When everyone was paying a visit to the emperor's court, India was the only one standing out. India refused to endorse the project, refused to participate in the project, spoke about the lack of transparency, the opacity, the perverse, debt practices, and political expansionism embedded within that initiative. And we took a very bold initiative. Now,
but we also pulled out of RCEP, maybe for the right reasons.
Again, for the same reason. I don't believe we should be endorsing RCEP because we are then endorsing Chinese bad practices. With every other country, we have bilateral arrangements. Signing an RCEP is endorsing Beijing's practices. I think it's a great geopolitical decision. But let me just end with one point. After refusing to be part of BRI, after refusing to be part of RCEP, because you fear Chinese malpractices and you want to oppose Chinese expansionist economic policies, why are you allowing China tech to infiltrate into your country so easily? Why is it that we have embraced digital BRI while we have stood outside the main BRI? I think we need to rethink our digital policies or our political policies. There is something incongruent here. You can't reject BRI and then embrace China tech. I think countries around the world need to start seeing China as a whole for what it is. I think people are being opportunistic simply because they don't have alternatives. And that's my final point. I think the world, India, the US, Japan, Australia, Korea, Indonesia, and others need to begin to realize that saying China is a problem is not good enough. A solution has to be put on the table. Now, telling an African country that infrastructure finance from China is a bad idea, you will be bankrupt in a few years, is nice and it sounds good at that time. But if you tell them here is an alternative line of funding that can build the same project, that can create the same power plant, that can build a port for your country, is the right way to go about it. I think all of us, the Chinese have put money on the table, we have put books on the table. What the rest of the world has done is it has written about Chinese malevolence, while the Chinese have put money on the table. I think it's time to stop putting books on the table and start putting bonds on the table. I think the Western bond markets, the Western funds, the Western investment needs to start providing alternatives to folks who are mainly engaging with the Chinese because they have no alternative. So, it is not just the dictum that familiarity breeds.
And I think now is a great time because the narrative. Then now is a great time, Samir, because investors around the globe, and there is a continuing hunt for yields. And in the post-corona world, I think a country like India definitely offers that return that most global investors want, and they don't get it in other Western democracies and other big economies, including China, at this point. The second question, I think we are nearly ending near the end of this episode, but I want to touch upon one important aspect that we probably missed out, and but both of you gentlemen spoke about it, about creating an Asian Union, and considering that these are the economies that are going to be the leading economies of the next 5 decades. Will this Asian Union what will it look like? Will it be something that will be merged within the UN, and the actors will change, or will these new multilateral organizations led by Asia be completely a separate unit set up in the next few years?
So let me say on that, I don't think we'll ever actually have an Asian Union in the sense of what the European Union has. There cannot be a supranationalism amongst Asians given the incredible diversity that exists, right? So in the European circumstances are obviously quite unique, given again their how compact the geography is.
I am aware of this view from you, Parag, but I will let you finish this thought because the audience may not be. But what I was trying to understand is, will we have a new United Nations headquartered in Delhi or Beijing or Singapore?
Well, just remember that because Asia is most of the world, there's no need to worry about what the United Nations does or does not do. For Asia to govern itself better is Asia's contribution to global governance, let alone all of the benefits that Asia's growth and exports bring to the rest of the world. So we don't really need to care, quite frankly, about the United Nations per se right now. The question is, what does an Asian commonwealth of states look like? What does an Asian, sort of organization or institutions look like? And Samir was absolutely right at the beginning. He said, look, we do not have a sufficient number of robust Asian institutions, an Asian monetary fund, sufficient swap and credit lines between Asian central banks, Asian trade agreements that actually have harmonized regulations rather than this patchwork where some of it is Chinese malpractice, as he was rightly saying, and so forth. So a lot more can be done. And then, of course, infrastructure finance. You're left with either the Chinese
I want to bring in the experience of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Fund, and how it has been a big success. Not just in Asia, it has been a big money spinner for investors around the world.
Look, the AIB is a very good example of one such entity. It will be a building block. It already is a building block of what an Asian order looks like, because it does disperse money broadly. India is the largest recipient of AIB loans. So you can, on the one hand, make a valid political statement in rejecting the BRI, but on the other hand, play ball with a very legitimate institution because it has a legitimate purpose, which is stimulating infrastructure.
And it has an open governance architecture.
Absolutely.
And it has shaped itself and modeled itself on the ADB and the World Bank. And India is the second largest equity holder in that bank as well. So the point here is that you should not be rejecting China. You have to work with China. The Asian, let me use Parag's book's title. Let me plug for him. The future is Asian, but that Asian future will need a concert between certain important actors, and only then will the Asian be future. Will the future be Asian? Otherwise, it will be part Chinese, part Indian, part Russian, part Japanese. I think you're never going to have a European Union style political arrangement. You will have several Asian concerts happening at different places. You will have the SCO, you will have the ASEAN, you will have the Gulf GCC, you will have the Indian Ocean Rim Association, you'll have multiple concerts taking place, and we need a coherence between these different concerts so that the larger Asian symphony is largely something that we all can enjoy.
It sounds a lot like the global order right now sounds a lot like Indian politics, crowded with regional parties without a national agenda. But having said that, and I want to bring this in connection with the multilateral agencies that sort of are at the center of, we've realized their importance in the coronavirus world. But I know, Samir, you are a very harsh critic of the World Health Organization. And the way it has
I'm not a critic of the World Health Organization. It's good I'm using your platform to clarify. I think Dr. Tedros was terrible. I think he failed in leadership. I think the World Health Organization is an absolutely important institution. I think its management was politically subservient, and that is different. Bad management doesn't mean bad institution. I think WHO needs to be radically reformed, revived, and made to serve global communities, not serve the interest of one actor. My problem with the WHO was that it was captured by China to serve its propaganda needs.
No, but what I'm trying to allude to is a temptation for a multilateral organization so far under the the shadow of US to so easily be swayed in favor of China, and why that can't happen in other multilateral organizations. Do you?
No, it will happen in all multilateral institutions. Every political leadership in a multinational institution will be swayed by some political power, because the leadership is dependent on being re-elected on that political power. Now, I think Shashi Tharoor gave a
Is that power China? Is that power
it doesn't
China?
matter.
Is the point.
I don't think this is an anti-China position that I have taken. I have taken a position that WHO has to serve the global community, not Chinese interests. Now, it doesn't matter. Now, if WHO was serving American interests and creating conspiracy theories around the origin of the virus, then I think WHO would be equally perverse in its discharge of duties. Now, so I am not having to choose between two perverse actors. I think WHO has to be an international organization. I think Shashi Tharoor gave a good idea that day, that if you limit the term of the head of the organization to one term, make it 6 years, they have, once they come into the office, they have no need to serve anyone. I think
it should have term limits that should be universal across all multilateral bodies.
All multilateral systems.
Much easier to implement, quite frankly, in international organizations than in our own national politics.
Yeah, I think term limits is a great idea. Once the person knows that he doesn't have to serve anyone to be re-elected, he can serve the institution and the people he's meant to serve. WHO did bad because they were serving the wrong set of folks, not the global community that they are, responsible for.
And I also want to make a closing comment just to sort of clear the air on one of the conspiracy theories, like you said, you alluded to. I think the Twitter is still full of those, people sharing that kind of misinformation, that how coronavirus, the COVID-19 is a bio war started by China. I think both of you gentlemen disagree with it. And do you want to say one line each on why is it impossible for something like that to happen, at least in 2020?
No, I see. Again, my debunking conspiracy theories is not a scientific assertion that I know what happened.
That's okay.
I think we must be very careful.
I'll tell you,
You're asking me to.
We had a political scientist on our panel.
That this did not happen. What I have said is that the conspiracy theories need to be debunked. We don't know. I think the European Union position, the Australian position, and some other countries that are seeking a transparent investigation into how the interspecies jump took place is a valid demand. All of us must demand that of the WHO and of the Chinese, that a scientific inquiry, once the peak infections have been managed, must take place. We must be prepared for the future. I think some of the scientific evidence points to the wet markets. Then we must respond to the wet market malpractice, if I could call it that. And if it was human experimentation, that must too be stopped. But to call it bio war or bio weapon, and I think that is probably something which is frivolous and facetious.
Absolutely. Parag?
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, because we had a British diplomat who had served in many countries for many decades and is now as a political scientist in his own right. And he said that I have served in so many countries and I don't think any bureaucrat has the competence to execute something like this without being caught for so long.
Yeah, हमारा तो lockdown, they can't execute our lockdown and the opening up without 25 clarificatory notes. Anyways, and now, imagining the same set of people to create this highly conspiratorial, anyways, so that's a different debate. I'm sure you will have it again with some other panelists.
I think, though, to bring it back to our central subject, we should not have rose-tinted glasses and expect transparency from China. So since we are not going to have transparency from China, it really does reinforce the central message that we have to be on guard, in a way, against abuse of Chinese power and authority, whether it is geopolitical, whether it is economic, or whether it is diplomatic.
Okay. And let me conclude by just adding to that. I think Chinese models operate in the night. They need darkness to thrive. If you want an Asian century of light, we need a different political arrangement for Asia.
That's a fantastic closing line for a very riveting discussion that we've had. I still have at least 5 more questions for each one of them, both Parag and Samir. But that's all the time we have in our special broadcast today. But I want to summarize this entire conversation for our viewers. I think the essential message that is coming from both Parag and Samir, who have slightly different takes on what the future of Asia is going to be, but what they agree upon is this. China is powerful. It is likely to be more powerful, but it shouldn't be. And that will happen only if countries that are similar in nature, where people believe in democracies, like India, Singapore, Australia, and other Asian countries in the Asian region, who believe that the future has to be more humane and led by technology, which is not driven by corporate interests or the interest of the government. People who believe in surveillance, people who believe in, sort of keeping people under check. The technology of the future should be different from these two. One is the American style, one is the Chinese style, and we should develop a more humane development of technology in the years to come. And that is where India can find its place in the world. And that is, I think, a sort of a short summary of what we discussed here. And for that to happen, India needs the support, and it should offer its support also to other similar nations who believe in democracies. And this is, I think, a strong message for people who do not understand or not interested in geopolitics. For every one of those people who are sitting in their drawing rooms and saying, you know what, we should totally work like China, our government should be like China, that's when we will grow, that's when we'll be rich. You don't really know what you're wishing for. And if it comes true, it could be a lot more dangerous than you can imagine. So before forming opinions, before forwarding those conspiracy theories on your WhatsApp, before putting out very loose uninformed messages on TikTok, please make sure that you have enough information, because like I said just now, what you wish for could be very dangerous. Thank you so much, Parag and Samir, for your time.
Thank you.
And we hope to get you back again on Business Insider for more conversations, because the post-coronavirus world is just as uncertain as it was a few weeks ago. And I think a lot more minds need to come together. A lot more knowledge needs to come together to build a better world for ourselves.
Thank you so much. Great.
With that, this is Sriram Iyer signing off.